You are in direct violation of airport regulations. Get this plane off the runway immediately!
The summer sun beat down mercilessly on the private aviation terminal's tarmac, turning the asphalt into a shimmering sea of heat. Against this backdrop stood a sleek white Gulfstream G650, its polished surface reflecting the crystalline sky like a mirror of luxury and power. The boarding stairs descended invitingly, yet three figures blocked the entrance in a tableau that would soon unravel careers, shatter assumptions, and expose the ugly truth about who is allowed to occupy spaces of wealth and influence in America. She stood there in her emerald green business suit, tailored to perfection, her long dark hair catching the breeze that swept across the runway. Dr. Amara Chen-Williams, founder and CEO of Tech Vanguard Solutions, a woman who had just closed a $2.3 billion acquisition deal in Singapore, a woman whose signature had authorized the purchase of the very aircraft behind her, now faced two uniformed aviation officers and a terminal manager whose face had gone crimson with misplaced authority. His finger jabbed the air between them like a weapon, his voice carrying across the tarmac with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been questioned, never having been held accountable, never having imagined that the person he was screaming at might actually own everything around them. "You need to step away from this aircraft immediately. This is private property, and I don't care what story you've concocted. Security is already on their way." The words hung in the air, each syllable dripping with assumption, with prejudice, with the kind of casual racism that hides behind professional protocols and safety concerns. But what those three people didn't know, what they couldn't have possibly imagined as they formed their human barricade, was that they were standing between a lioness and her pride, between a woman and her dignity, between truth and the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about merit, belonging, and who deserves to fly at 51,000 feet. The question wasn't whether they would let her board. The question was what would happen when they discovered who she really was, and could they survive the answer? 48 hours earlier, Dr. Amara Chen-Williams had been standing in a completely different kind of heat, the humid, electric atmosphere of Singapore's Marina Bay, closing the most significant deal of her 15-year career. But to understand how she arrived at that moment, how she came to stand on a runway in Dallas facing down ignorance and institutional racism, you need to understand where she came from, the invisible battles she'd fought every single day, and the weight she carried in her tailored suits and measured smiles. Amara was born in Baltimore to a Taiwanese immigrant mother who worked 3 jobs and a black father who had been a promising engineer before a wrongful conviction stole 12 years of his life. She grew up in a 1-bedroom apartment where the sounds of the city, sirens, arguments, music, life, poured through thin walls, and where dinner was often creativity stretched across scarcity. Her mother, Lynn, would work the early morning shift at a bakery, the afternoon at a dry cleaner, and 3 evenings a week cleaning office buildings in the financial district. Her father, Marcus, came home when Amara was 9, a man transformed by incarceration but not broken, determined that his daughter would have every advantage he'd been denied. "You are going to have to be twice as good to get half as far," her father told her one night, helping her with calculus homework at their tiny kitchen table, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead. "And even then, baby girl, some people will never see you. They'll see everything but you. So you build something so undeniable, so brilliant, that they have no choice but to look." She built that undeniable thing through full scholarships, through being the only black woman in most of her classes at MIT, through the subtle erosions of confidence that came from professors who called on her less, from study groups that somehow always formed without her, from job interviews where she could see the surprise flash across faces when she walked in, as if her resume and her appearance existed in 2 separate realities. After graduating top of her class with degrees in computer science and business, she founded Tech Vanguard Solutions at 26 with $50,000 cobbled together from a small business loan, her parents' savings, and maxed-out credit cards. The company started in a shared workspace in Oakland, building cybersecurity solutions for small businesses. Amara coded through the night, pitched during the day, learned to navigate rooms full of venture capitalists who touched her hair without permission, who asked if she really wrote the code herself, who suggested she might want a more experienced co-founder, code for white and male, to help with credibility. She smiled through the microaggressions, documented the blatant discrimination, and built her company into a fortress of excellence that spoke for itself. 15 years later, Tech Vanguard Solutions employed 3,000 people across 6 countries, held patents on revolutionary encryption technologies, and had just been valued at $8.7 billion. Amara herself had accumulated a personal fortune of $2.1 billion, had been featured on the covers of Forbes, Fortune, and Time, and had used her wealth to create scholarship funds for underrepresented students in STEM, bail funds for wrongfully convicted individuals like her father had been, and investment capital for minority-owned startups. She bought her parents a house with a garden where her mother grew vegetables and her father built furniture in a workshop that smelled of cedar and second chances. And she'd bought herself that Gulfstream G650, a $70 million statement of arrival, of overcoming, of claiming space in a sky that had always seemed reserved for others. She'd customized it with her company's colors, installed satellite offices in the cabin, and employed a crew of 5 who respected her, not because they had to, but because she'd earned it through competence, kindness, and the kind of leadership that lifted others. The morning she left for Singapore, Amara had breakfast with her parents in their sun-filled kitchen. Her mother made scallion pancakes, the smell transporting Amara back to childhood, to resilience, to the immigrant determination that flowed through her veins. Her father, now 68, with silver threading through his hair, gripped her hand across the table. "You know what I'm most proud of?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Not the money, not the company. I'm proud that you never let them make you smaller, that you grew into exactly who you were meant to be, despite everything they did to prune you down." "I learned from the best," Amara replied, squeezing back, feeling the roughness of his hands, hands that had built things, that had survived, that had shown her what endurance looked like. The Singapore deal had been 18 months in the making, the acquisition of a smaller tech firm whose innovations in artificial intelligence would catapult Tech Vanguard into the next stratosphere of industry dominance. The negotiations had been complex, the cultural navigation delicate, and the final handshake came at 2 a.m. Singapore time after 47 hours of consecutive meetings, revisions, and the kind of high-stakes chess that left even Amara drained. But she'd done it. They'd done it. Her and the team she'd assembled, a deliberately diverse group of brilliant minds who understood that innovation came from varied perspectives, from people who'd had to think differently because they'd never been allowed into traditional paths. When she finally returned to her hotel room at the Marina Bay Sands, she stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city's glittering skyline and allowed herself a moment of pure satisfaction. In a few hours, she'd board her plane, fly home to Dallas, where Tech Vanguard's headquarters had relocated 3 years earlier, and announce the acquisition that would cement her company's position as an industry titan. She dressed carefully that morning for the flight home, the emerald green suit from a black-owned designer she'd commissioned, tailored precisely to her frame, paired with Italian heels and minimal jewelry except for the necklace her mother had given her, a small jade pendant that represented luck and protection. Her hair, which she'd worn natural for the past 5 years after decades of straightening it to fit corporate expectations, fell in long, luxurious waves past her shoulders. She looked in the mirror and saw a woman in command, a woman who belonged, a woman who had earned every single thing she had achieved.
The flight from Singapore to Dallas, with a fuel stop in Anchorage, should have been seamless. Her crew knew her, her plane was maintained to perfection, and the private aviation world, she had believed, operated on a level where wealth and achievement transcended the petty discriminations of commercial travel. She'd been wrong before about spaces that should have been safe, about assumptions that should have been absurd, but somehow she'd thought that owning the plane might finally be enough. The Anchorage stop went smoothly, quick refueling, a brief conversation with the flight crew about weather patterns and arrival times, a catnap in the cabin's bedroom suite while the Arctic sun hung perpetually in the sky. When they landed in Dallas at the private aviation terminal at 3 p.m. on a Thursday, Amara was refreshed, energized, ready to return to her office, to her team, to the announcements and celebrations that awaited. She'd said goodbye to her crew inside the plane, gathering her briefcase and carry-on, thanking them for the excellent service. Captain Morrison, a silver-haired woman who'd been flying for 30 years, had smiled warmly. "See you next week for the Boston trip, Dr. Williams. Congratulations again on the deal." Amara descended the stairs alone, her heels clicking against the metal steps, the Dallas heat enveloping her like a familiar blanket after the air-conditioned perfection of the cabin. Her car service was scheduled to pick her up at the private terminal entrance, and she'd walked this route dozens of times, through the small terminal building, past the pilot's lounge, out to the passenger pickup area. It was a space designed for discretion, for ease, for people who valued their time and their privacy. She was halfway across the tarmac, her plane gleaming white behind her, when she heard the shout, "Hey, hey, you there! Stop right there!" Amara turned, confused, to see a man in a terminal manager's uniform jogging towards her, his face already flushed, 2 security officers flanking him. She stopped, waiting, assuming perhaps there was some administrative issue, some paperwork her assistant had forgotten to file, some minor inconvenience that would be quickly resolved. She had no idea that the next 20 minutes would become the most humiliating, the most rage-inducing, and ultimately the most career-destroying moment for everyone involved, except her. She stood there on the tarmac, her briefcase in hand, her dignity intact but about to be tested, waiting for the 3 people rushing towards her to realize their mistake, waiting for the moment when recognition would dawn, when embarrassment would flush their faces, when apologies would tumble out. But that moment wouldn't come, not yet, not nearly long enough.
The terminal manager reached her first, breathing hard, his face a mottled red that spoke of stress, heat, and righteous indignation. His name badge read Robert Hendricks, Terminal Operations Manager, and his eyes swept over Amara with the kind of assessment that she'd learned to recognize instantly, the assessment that saw her skin before it saw anything else, that calculated threat before confirming identity, that jumped to conclusions with the confidence of someone who'd never been wrong because he'd never been challenged. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see your identification and documentation for why you're on this tarmac," Hendricks said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who believed his uniform granted him unquestionable power. "This is a restricted area, and we've had issues with people trying to access private aircraft without authorization." Amara's first response was confusion more than anger. She'd just walked off her own plane, on a tarmac she'd traversed countless times, in a terminal where her company had a corporate account worth hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. Her second response was the familiar, sinking recognition, the understanding that somehow, despite everything, despite her success and her visibility and her undeniable presence, she was being seen as a threat, as someone who didn't belong, as someone who needed to explain herself. "I'm Dr. Amara Chen-Williams," she said, her voice measured and professional, the tone she'd perfected over years of having to explain herself in spaces where others walked through unchallenged. "I just deplaned from that aircraft, that Gulfstream still gleaming in the afternoon sun. My car service should be here momentarily." Hendricks's eyes narrowed, and Amara watched something harden in his expression. Not belief, not recognition, but increased suspicion. The two security officers, both white men in their 30s, wearing uniforms that marked them as terminal security rather than federal agents, positioned themselves on either side of their manager, creating a wall of authority between Amara and the terminal building. "That aircraft is registered to Tech Vanguard Solutions," Hendricks said, pulling out a tablet and scrolling through what appeared to be a manifest. "And there's no passenger named Amara Williams listed on the flight plan that arrived from Anchorage." "Chen-Williams," Amara corrected, feeling the first tendrils of real frustration beginning to coil in her chest. "I wouldn't necessarily be listed as a passenger because I own the company. That's my plane." The words hung in the air, and Amara watched as disbelief flickered across all three faces. Not surprised disbelief, not the pleasant shock of unexpected information, but the dismissive disbelief of people who'd already decided she was lying, who couldn't reconcile the woman standing before them with the idea of ownership, of wealth, of authority. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to stop with the false claims," Hendricks said, his voice taking on an edge of aggression. "We take security very seriously here, and impersonating a business owner or making false statements about aircraft ownership is a federal offense. Now, I'm giving you one more chance to tell me the truth about why you're on this tarmac before I call actual law enforcement." The casual threat, delivered with the confidence of someone who believed he held all the power, sent a jolt of cold anger through Amara's body. She'd dealt with skepticism before, had faced countless moments where her credentials were questioned, her authority undermined, her very presence treated as suspicious. But this, being threatened with arrest while standing next to her own $70 million aircraft, represented a level of erasure so profound that for a moment she couldn't find words. "I am telling you the truth," Amara said, her voice steady despite the rage building inside. "I am the CEO and founder of Tech Vanguard Solutions. This is my aircraft. My crew is still inside if you need confirmation. My pilot is Captain Jennifer Morrison. You can verify everything I'm saying with a single phone call." One of the security officers, a younger man with a crew cut and a nervous energy, glanced back at the plane as if considering her suggestion, but Hendricks held up his hand, stopping him. "We're not bothering the crew of a registered aircraft based on the claims of someone who's trespassing," each word delivered like a small act of violence. "What we're going to do is escort you off this tarmac and into the terminal, where we can properly verify your identity and determine what charges need to be filed." Amara's fire pulsed quicken, felt the familiar sensation of being trapped in a reality that refused to acknowledge truth. She'd learned over decades that certain situations with authority figures, especially white authority figures who'd already decided you were guilty, could escalate dangerously if you asserted yourself too strongly. The memory of her father's false conviction, of the 12 years stolen from him because of assumptions and prejudice, flashed through her mind. "I'm not going anywhere until you verify what I'm telling you," Amara said, standing her ground, but keeping her hands visible, her posture non-threatening, performing the exhausting dance that black people learn early, how to assert your rights while not appearing aggressive, how to demand dignity while not seeming difficult, how to exist as fully human while others insist on seeing you as threatening. "Then we have a problem," Hendricks replied, and pulled out his radio. "This is terminal operations. I need additional security and local PD to the executive aviation tarmac. I have an uncooperative individual refusing to leave a restricted area." The words uncooperative individual struck Amara like a physical blow. She'd been nothing but cooperative, nothing but truthful, and yet already she was being coded in language designed to justify whatever came next. She thought of all the videos she'd seen, all the stories she'd heard of black people trying to enter their own homes, their own cars, their own spaces, confronted by authorities or vigilantes who couldn't fathom that they belonged.
"This is absurd," Amara said, her voice rising slightly despite her efforts to stay calm. "I'm standing next to my own plane. My crew is inside and can verify everything I'm saying. My company has an account with this terminal. I have my ID, my pilot's license, documentation of ownership, everything you could possibly need to confirm my identity. Why are you refusing to do basic verification before escalating this?" But she knew why. She could see it in Hendrix's jaw, in the way the security officers positioned themselves as if she might suddenly become violent, in the curious stares of other terminal workers who'd begun to gather at a distance, watching the spectacle of a black woman being confronted on the tarmac. She knew why because she'd lived it 1,000 times in smaller ways. The store security that followed her through high-end boutiques, even as she carried shopping bags from previous purchases. The restaurant hostesses who asked multiple times if she had a reservation. The colleagues who assumed she was administrative staff rather than the founder. The constant grinding presumption that she couldn't possibly be who she said she was. "Captain Morrison?" Captain Morrison appeared at the top of the aircraft stairs, having apparently noticed the commotion. "Is Dr. Williams everything all right?" Amara felt a surge of relief, vindication flowing through her veins. "Captain Morrison, could you please confirm my identity to the terminal manager?" But Hendrix held up his hand again, this time more aggressively. "Ma'am, please return to the aircraft. We're handling a security situation and don't need interference from the crew." Morrison's face showed confusion, then dawning understanding as she took in the scene, her employer surrounded by security, being treated like a criminal. "That's Dr. Amara Chen-Williams, the owner of Tech Vanguard Solutions, and this aircraft. She's who she says she is." "And you are?" Hendrix asked, his tone suggesting Morrison's verification meant nothing, that he'd already decided on his narrative and would not be swayed by inconvenient facts. "Captain Jennifer Morrison. I've been piloting for Dr. Williams for 3 years." "Right. Well, Captain, you can return to your aircraft while we sort this out. This doesn't concern you." The dismissal was so absolute, so confident, that Morrison hesitated at the top of the stairs, clearly torn between following orders and defending her employer. The power dynamics were carefully designed. Hendrix held positional authority within the terminal, and challenging him could result in Morrison being flagged, her access to the terminal revoked, her career affected. The system protected itself. "It's okay, Captain," Amara called out, not wanting Morrison to suffer consequences for trying to help. "I'll handle this." Morrison retreated reluctantly, and Amara heard her on the phone inside the aircraft, likely calling Tech Vanguard's legal team, her assistant, someone who could cut through this absurdity. But absurdity, Amara had learned, had a way of persisting when it was wrapped in the armor of institutional authority. 2 more security officers arrived, along with 2 police officers from the Dallas Police Department. The situation had officially escalated from humiliating to potentially dangerous. Amara felt her pulse quicken, felt the familiar sensation of being trapped in a reality that refused to acknowledge truth. She'd learned over decades that certain situations with authority figures, especially white authority figures who'd already decided you were guilty, could escalate dangerously if you asserted yourself too strongly. The memory of her father's false conviction, of the 12 years stolen from him because of assumptions and prejudice, flashed through her mind. "I'm not going anywhere until you verify what I'm telling you," Amara said, standing her ground, but keeping her hands visible, her posture non-threatening, performing the exhausting dance that black people learn early, how to assert your rights while not appearing aggressive, how to demand dignity while not seeming. Amara walked toward the terminal building with measured steps, her briefcase in hand, her dignity refusing to be broken despite the assault it had just endured. Behind her, the Gulfstream gleamed in the afternoon sun, a monument to possibility and achievement that had meant nothing to the men who'd surrounded her. Her phone continued buzzing, messages from her leadership team, her legal counsel, her public relations director, all of them having seen the videos that were already spreading across social media platforms like wildfire. But she didn't stop to read them.
She walked through the terminal, through the pilot's lounge where conversation stopped as she passed, through the concierge area where staff suddenly became very interested in their computer screens, and out to where her car service waited. The driver, a black man in his 50s named Jerome, who'd been driving her for 2 years, took one look at her face and said nothing, just opened the door and waited for her to settle before closing it gently. "You okay, Dr. Williams?" he asked once they were on the highway. "No," Amara said, the simple honesty feeling like the only real thing in the past hour. "But I will be." The drive to Tech Vanguard headquarters took 25 minutes, and Amara spent them in silence, watching Dallas pass by the tinted windows, feeling the rage in her chest transform from hot and chaotic into something cold, calculated, focused. She'd built an empire by channeling anger into action, by taking the energy of injustice and forging it into solutions, into change, into power that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. Her phone rang. Her mother. Amara answered. "I saw the video, baby girl. Are you hurt?" "Not physically," Amara replied, her voice thick. "But hurt nonetheless. I know that hurt. Your father knows that hurt. It's the hurt of being told you don't exist, that you don't matter, that everything you've built can be erased by someone who can't see past your skin." "Mama, I'm so angry." "I know. But you're also powerful, and you're going to make them understand exactly what they did, exactly who they dismissed, exactly what it costs to treat black excellence as a threat." The words settled into Amara's bones, giving shape to the formless rage. By the time Jerome pulled up to Tech Vanguard's glass and steel headquarters, she knew exactly what she was going to do. Her leadership team was waiting in the executive conference room, her COO, Marcus, her general counsel, Diane, her PR director, James, and her head of corporate security, Reginald. They stood as she entered, their faces showing a mixture of concern, anger, and professional readiness. "Tell me everything that's been happening since the video went viral," Amara said, not bothering with preliminaries. James pulled up his tablet. 17 different videos from the tarmac have been posted across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. Combined views are already over 8 million and climbing. The hashtags Private Jet CEO and Black Woman CEO are trending nationally. News outlets are picking it up. CNN, MSNBC, Fox, all of them. We've had 43 media requests in the past hour. The aviation terminal's parent company, Summit Aviation Services, has issued a preliminary statement saying they're investigating the incident. Classic corporate deflection. But they're vulnerable here. This is textbook racial profiling, false detention, and they have no legal ground to stand on. Reginald cleared his throat. "I pulled the background on Robert Hendricks, the terminal manager. 5 years at that location, multiple commendations for security excellence, but also 3 informal complaints from passengers of color that were never formally investigated. The pattern is clear." Amara absorbed the information, her mind working through strategies, consequences, leverage points. "What are our options?" she asked. Diane leaned forward. "We can pursue civil litigation, false imprisonment, emotional distress, civil rights violations. We'd win, easily. Or we can leverage our corporate relationship. Tech Vanguard spends approximately $800,000 annually with Summit Aviation Services across all our private aviation needs. We have the power to walk away, to publicly explain why we're walking away, and to encourage our network of companies to do the same." "Or," Marcus said quietly, "we can do both. We can pursue justice through the courts and consequences through the market. We can make this a case study in what happens when you racially profile the wrong person, not because the wrong person is someone wealthy and powerful, but because the wrong person is anyone at all, and the fact that you did it to someone wealthy and powerful means the consequences will be visible and unavoidable." Amara felt something click into place. "I want a complete audit of Summit Aviation Services, their hiring practices, their complaint history, any patterns of discrimination. I want to know if what happened to me is an isolated incident or part of a systemic problem." "Already started," Reginald said. "I have 3 investigators pulling everything we can access legally." "Good.
James, I want to hold a press conference tomorrow, not here, at the terminal. I want to stand next to that plane and tell my story, the full story, in my own words. I want every detail documented, how long I was detained, what was said, what was refused. I want the public to understand that this isn't about me being a CEO. This is about what happens to black people in spaces where we're assumed not to belong. The narrative is already running away from us, James warned. Some of the conservative outlets are framing this as a security professional doing his job, claiming that protocols were followed. Then we need to control our own narrative, Amara replied. Get me data on racial profiling in private aviation. Get me statements from other black pilots, other black executives who faced similar treatment. Show that this isn't an anomaly, it's a pattern. And I want to announce that Tech Vanguard Solutions is immediately terminating all contracts with Summit Aviation Services and will be working with the National Civil Aviation Review Board to develop new anti-discrimination protocols for private terminals. The room went quiet as the implications settled. Marcus spoke first. You're going to war. No, Amara corrected. I'm demanding accountability. There's a difference. War implies two equal sides. What I'm doing is using every tool available to me to ensure that what happened to me doesn't happen to the next black woman that walks across that tarmac, or the one after that, or the one after that, because I have the resources to fight this fight, and that means I have the responsibility to fight this fight. Diane nodded slowly. It's going to get ugly. They'll try to discredit you, to find anything in your past they can weaponize. You'll be accused of playing the race card, of being too sensitive, of making it about race when it was just about security. Are you ready for that? Amara thought about her father, about the 12 years stolen from him, about the lifetime of caution he'd had to adopt afterwards, always looking over his shoulder, always waiting for the next accusation. She thought about her mother, working 3 jobs while raising a child alone, never complaining, never stopping. She thought about all the black women who'd come before her, who'd paved the way with their excellence and their refusal to accept less than full humanity. I've been ready my entire life, Amara said. Let's show them what accountability looks like. Over the next 72 hours, Amara orchestrated a response that would become a blueprint for how marginalized people with power could demand systemic change. The press conference was held on the same tarmac where she'd been detained, her Gulfstream gleaming behind her, a physical manifestation of her legitimacy. She spoke for 18 minutes without notes, her voice steady and clear, detailing every moment of the encounter, every refusal to verify her identity, every threat that had been made. I want to be clear about something, she said, looking directly into the cameras. What happened to me was not okay, but what makes it particularly dangerous is that I had the resources, the visibility, the platform to demand accountability. What happens to the black pilot who's questioned at the gate, the black executive who stopped in the terminal, the black traveler who's subjected to extra screening, not because of their behavior, but because of their skin? They don't have corporate legal teams. They don't have media access. They don't have the ability to walk away from an $800,000 contract and make the market feel it. So when I say I'm fighting this, I'm not just fighting for me. I'm fighting for every person who's been made to feel like they don't belong in spaces they've earned access to. The video of her statement went more viral than the original incident, accumulating 40 million views in 5 days. Think pieces proliferated, some supportive, some dismissive, some attempting nuanced analysis of racism in elite spaces. Summit Aviation Services stock dropped 7%. Robert Hendricks was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The police sergeant who verified Amara's identity gave an interview praising her composure while noting that the terminal manager had overreached significantly. But the real climax came 6 days after the incident, when Summit Aviation Services CEO Richard Connors requested a meeting with Amara. They met in Tech Vanguard's headquarters, in the conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Dallas, Connors sitting across from Amara, with their respective legal teams flanking them.
Dr. Williams, Connors began, his discomfort visible. I want to personally apologize for what you experienced. It was unacceptable, and it doesn't represent our values as a company. Amara regarded him coolly. Your company's values are demonstrated by its actions, not its statements, and the actions show a pattern of racial profiling that's been documented, complained about, and ignored. We're taking steps. You're taking steps now that you're caught publicly, Amara.
3 months after the incident on the Dallas tarmac, Amara stood in the same conference room where she'd negotiated Summit Aviation Services accountability measures, looking out at the city as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. On the table behind her sat 3 reports: the completed independent audit of Summit Aviation Services, which had found systemic issues with complaint handling and implicit bias in security protocols; a policy brief she'd co-authored with the National Civil Aviation Review Board on anti-discrimination standards for private aviation; and a letter from Robert Hendricks's attorney threatening to sue her for defamation and loss of employment. She smiled at that last one, a cold, satisfied smile. Let him sue. Discovery would be delicious. Her assistant knocked and entered. "Dr. Williams, your parents are here." Amara turned as Lynn and Marcus walked in, her mother carrying a container of homemade dumplings, her father with a newspaper tucked under his arm, the physical kind because he'd never fully transitioned to digital. They embraced, and Amara felt herself relax in a way she only could with them, the people who'd known her before the wealth, before the company, before the public persona. "We saw the 60 Minutes piece," her mother said, settling into a chair and pushing the dumplings toward Amara. "You were magnificent." The interview had aired the previous Sunday, a 15-minute segment that included footage from the tarmac, Amara's press conference, and a sit-down interview where she'd spoken not just about her experience, but about the broader context of discrimination in elite spaces. The interviewer had asked her the question that everyone seemed to want answered. "Do you think this would have happened if you were white?" Amara had looked directly into the camera and said, "I know it wouldn't have, and that's not an opinion. That's statistical reality. Study after study shows that black people are subjected to heightened scrutiny, questioned more frequently, and perceived as threats in situations where white people move through unchallenged. What happened to me wasn't an anomaly, it was predictable. The only surprising part was that I had the platform to make the consequences visible." Her father unfolded his newspaper, showing her the editorial page. "You made the Times, opinion piece about how your case is changing industry standards." Amara scanned the article, which detailed how 3 other private aviation companies had proactively adopted similar oversight measures to what Summit had agreed to, not wanting to become the next public example of institutional racism. The market, as it turned out, responded to visibility. Companies were falling over themselves to demonstrate their commitment to anti-discrimination, to diversity, to treating all customers with equal dignity, not because they'd suddenly developed moral clarity, but because Amara had made the cost of not doing so too high. "I can't fight every battle," Amara said quietly. "I can't be there for every person who gets profiled, every injustice that happens in airports and terminals and private spaces. It's too much." "You can't fight every battle," her father agreed, "but you changed the battlefield. You made it riskier for companies to ignore discrimination. You gave other people language and leverage to demand better. You created a template for how power can be used for accountability. That matters, even when it feels insufficient." The words settled into Amara's chest, heavy and true. She thought about the messages she'd received, hundreds of them, from black professionals, from parents, from young people who'd seen the videos and felt seen themselves. One message in particular had stuck with her, from a 16-year-old black girl who wrote, "I want to be a pilot. I've wanted it my whole life, but I've been scared because I don't see people who look like me flying planes, and I didn't know if I'd be allowed to belong. After seeing you stand up for yourself, I'm not scared anymore. Thank you for showing me that I have a right to take up space, even when people tell me I don't." That was the real victory, Amara realized. Not the policy changes, or the terminated employee, or the public apologies. The victory was in the shift in imagination, in the way visibility expanded possibility, in the message that black excellence demanded recognition rather than begging for it. Her phone buzzed, her assistant again. "The Summit Aviation CEO is here for your scheduled check-in." Amara nodded. Part of the agreement she'd negotiated was quarterly meetings to review the implementation of new policies, to assess the audit findings, to ensure that commitments made in the heat of public scrutiny weren't abandoned once the spotlight moved elsewhere. She was holding them accountable not just once, but continuously. "I have to take this meeting," she told her parents, "but stay. I want you to hear what accountability actually sounds like." Richard Connors entered 10 minutes later, looking significantly more humble than he had in their previous encounters. He was accompanied by Summit's new Chief Diversity Officer, a black woman named Dr. Patricia Munro that Amara had personally recommended for the position. "Dr. Williams, I want to update you on our progress. We've completed the first phase of mandatory anti-bias training for all staff. We've implemented the independent complaint review process, and we've hired Dr. Munro to oversee our diversity initiatives going forward." Dr. Munro pulled out a report. "I've been conducting focus groups with employees and customers of color, documenting their experiences with the company. The findings are sobering. What happened to you wasn't isolated. It was part of a culture where assumptions about who belongs in private aviation went unchallenged. We're working to fundamentally shift that culture, but I want to be clear with you that culture change doesn't happen overnight. This is a multi-year commitment." Amara nodded, appreciating the honesty. "What about Robert Hendricks? I heard through channels that he's threatening legal action." Connors grimaced. "He's filed a wrongful termination suit claiming he was following proper protocols. We're defending against it vigorously, and frankly, the documentation of his history makes his case weak, but it's going to be expensive and public." "Good," Amara said bluntly. "Let it be expensive. Let it be public. Let every other manager who thinks racial profiling is acceptable protocol see what it costs. That's how deterrence works." The meeting continued for another hour, covering specific metrics, timeline adjustments, and areas where implementation was lagging. Amara pushed on every point, refusing to accept vague commitments or delayed action. She'd learned long ago that change required relentless pressure, that powerful institutions reverted to old patterns the moment oversight relaxed. After Connors and Dr. Munro left, Amara returned to her parents. Her mother was reading something on her phone, shaking her head. "What is it, Mama?" More videos. Another black woman stopped at LAX while trying to board a commercial flight. They claimed her ticket was fraudulent, even though she'd bought it directly from the airline. It took 40 minutes and a supervisor before they let her board, and by then she'd missed her flight. The exhaustion hit Amara in waves. For every victory, for every policy changed, there were 100 more incidents, 1,000 more moments of discrimination that happened without cameras, without witnesses, without recourse. The work was endless, the mountain insurmountable, the progress painfully incremental. "I can't fight every battle," Amara said quietly. "I can't be there for every person who gets profiled, every injustice that happens in airports and terminals and private spaces. It's too much." "You can't fight every battle," her father agreed, "but you changed the battlefield. You made it riskier for companies to ignore discrimination. You gave other people language and leverage to demand better. You created a template for how power can be used for accountability. That matters, even when it feels insufficient." Amara looked at the reports on her table, at the evidence of change that was real but incomplete, transformative but limited. She thought about the 16-year-old aspiring pilot, about the other black professionals who'd reached out to thank her, about the way her case was being taught in business schools and law schools as an example of strategic activism. And she thought about the next time she'd walk across that tarmac, climb the stairs to her plane, and fly away. Would it be easier? Would the stairs less suspicious, the assumptions less reflexive? Maybe, maybe not.
but at least now there were consequences for treating her, for treating anyone as if they didn't belong in spaces they'd earned. She picked up her phone and opened Twitter, where the hashtag Black Women CEOs was still trending, filled with stories and support and solidarity. She composed a tweet. 3 months ago, I was detained on a tarmac and told I could possibly own my own plane. Today, that company has new anti-discrimination policies, independent oversight, and a terminated manager who's learning that racial profiling has consequences. This is what accountability looks like, but this is also what exhaustion looks like, the burden of having to fight for basic dignity over and over again. To every Black woman reading this, I see you, I believe you, and I'm committed to using my platform to make the spaces we occupy safer, fairer, and more just. We deserve to exist without constantly proving our right to exist. And we deserve allies who stand with us, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's costly, even when it requires them to examine their own complicity. Let's keep pushing. Let's keep demanding better. Let's keep reminding the world that our presence is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be celebrated. She hit send and watched the responses flood in. Thousands of retweets, tens of thousands of likes, comments from people who felt seen, who felt validated, who felt less alone in their own struggles.